Make today matter.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us on today's live stream, which will focus on how SEMLI is getting ready with the Varsity Cup athletes and how their research and work plays a big role in a variety of sports. My name is Sikandar Kala, and I will be joined by my colleagues, Professor Martin Schwalnus and Mr. Stephen Ball. The Sport, Exercise, Medicine and Lifestyle Institute, SEMLI, was established in 2015 under the directorship of Professor Martin Schwalnus. Prof. Schwalnus is a renowned physician in the field of sports and exercise medicine and is credited with the establishment of the first postgraduate training program in sports medicine in South Africa, which was established at the University of Cape Town in 1989. Over the past 25 years, Prof. Schwalnus has had a very active career in clinical service, teaching and research, for which he has received international recognition. He is a former president of the South African Sports Medicine Association, SASMA, a former vice president of the International Sports Medicine Federation, FIMS, and has served in the International Olympic Committee Medical and Science Group for 14 years. For the past 10 years, Prof. Schwalnus also served as the director of one of only 11 IOC-credited international research centers. He has published more than 160 peer-reviewed articles in accredited international scientific medical journals and has supervised numerous master's and PhD students. He is a dedicated clinician who provides clinical care to athletes and patients with chronic lifestyle-related diseases through a comprehensive lifestyle intervention program. He has been a regular member of a number of IOC and other international consensus statements and currently leads the International Consensus Group on Acute Respiratory Illness in Athletes, which also focuses on COVID-19 in athletes. Currently, he leads an international research program on athletes with acute respiratory infection, the AWARE studies. Prof. Schwalnus is an avid supporter of a healthy lifestyle and advocates regular exercise for young and old individuals. He's a recreational trail runner, mountain biker, and golfer. Our other speaker is Mr. Stephen Ball. Mr. Ball is the director of Tuck Sport and the acting CEO of the High Performance Center at the University of Pretoria. In 1997, Mr. Ball enrolled at Tuck's to study a Bachelor of Arts in Human Movement Science. In addition to these qualifications, Mr. Ball also completed the Management Advancement Program, MAP, at Wits Business School, as well as various other international high-performance coaching-related qualifications. He then obtained a Master of Philosophy in Business Management from the University of Pretoria, specializing in responsible leadership. Mr. Ball started his career at Tuck Sport and the Institute for Sport Research in 2001 as an intern biokineticist and sports scientist. During the time, he occupied several management positions at the High Performance Center, Canoeing South Africa, and Tuck's Aquatics, before he was appointed as Tuck Sport Deputy Director for Coaching and Performance Management in 2012. In the last month, Mr. Ball has assumed the role of the Director of Tuck Sport. welcome Prof. Schwalnus and Mr. Ball, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so, starting off with a few questions. I think this has been a particularly difficult time for a lot of individuals in the COVID-19 picture and the pandemic picture. So I'd just like to hear a bit of that. And I think if you could maybe give us an idea, Prof. Schwalnus, on how SEMLI plays a role in what they do, and a brief overview about what SEMLI is about.
Thank you very much for that. It's a pleasure to be here. SEMLI was established as a sport and exercise medicine and lifestyle institute. By the word institute is really that it's multidisciplinary. It focuses on a number of different areas, and its focus has research, teaching, and clinical service, all embraced in one. We conduct a lot of research projects, too many to maybe mention specifically now, but just to give you an idea of the quantum, we have between 30 and 40 masters and PhD and postdoc students who currently work on a variety of different projects. I'm sure we'll get into a discussion about COVID-19 and specifically what we do there in a moment, but that's an overview. We are part of the University of Pretoria, of course, as one of the institutes at the university.
Okay, fantastic. Sounds quite comprehensive.
Yeah, it is, and we have specific areas, of course, that we focus on. I think the introductory video showed a number of those very nicely. Yeah. I think if I had to sum it up in one sentence, we're really all about promoting sport, exercise, regular physical activity as part of a healthy lifestyle. And specifically, our research focus has been to make sure that when we prescribe exercise or encourage sports participation, that this is done safely. And by safely, we mean that we can try and do as much to prevent any injuries, but also keep athletes healthy. Yeah. And that includes, obviously, free from illness, and we're going to discuss COVID a bit this afternoon.
Well, that most certainly sounds rewarding, and I guess also has quite a preventative element to it as well. Okay. So Prof, also tell us, please give us an idea of what research is done specifically at SEMLI and some of the impact it's made in the world of sports.
So if one focuses specifically on the sports part, not so much on the lifestyle, although I've tried to make sure that people understand that there's a very strong link between them. The focus of SEMLI's research in sport has been on those two aspects that I mentioned just a moment ago. The one is to reduce the risk of injuries, in other words, injury prevention and injury management and getting athletes who have been injured safely back to sport is the one big aspect. And the second aspect is to make sure that athletes and people engaged in physical activity remain healthy. In other words, are free from so-called medical perhaps complications that can result from sport. Mm-hmm. For instance, just to take respiratory infections as an example, respiratory infections are less common in people that are active than people that are not active. But excessive exercise, too much, can maybe cause a depression in the immune system and predispose people. So we try to find that balance, and we conduct a variety of different research projects to make sure that we have a fine balance between top-level sport, top-level activity, high-intensity exercise, but keeping it safely.
Yeah, and I guess that speaks to the comprehensive nature of it.
Absolutely, from the spectrum of prevention right up to the end of the management, rehabilitation of problems, and then returning back to sport safely.
Okay, perfect. And, with that introduction of, fitting in COVID-19, the pandemic, has had massive impact. I myself, as a clinical psychologist, has just seen it on a mental health level, but also how that has trickled down into so many different aspects of how we live our lives. I see it with a lot of patients from sleep, appetite, energy, physical activity, just all of these things. And I'm wondering, with regard to the COVID-19 pandemic, how has it affected the type of research that you've done, and how has this been done?
Thanks for that question. I probably sit here representing hundreds of thousands of medical scientists around the world who a year and a half ago were doing their research in their respective areas. Yeah. And suddenly, about a year ago, we were all thrown out. So my own story with that is that I am chairing an International Olympic Committee consensus group, which was established about 6 months before the onset of the pandemic. And the focus of this consensus group was acute respiratory illness in the athlete. Mm. And it's because respiratory illness is actually the commonest illness in athletes. Mm. And we were going along very happily until December 2019. And of course, our world was thrown completely the other way around. And we reconvened early in last year to refocus our attention on COVID. And so we've been conducting, and many other people have also done so, conducting a variety of different projects to understand how this specific virus, which is one of many viruses that can cause respiratory illness, but how this specific virus maybe is different, and how the advice that we give to people, both in terms of exercise in a way to make sure that that doesn't predispose them on the one end, but also once somebody unfortunately has had COVID, how they can return back to safety. So we've created a group of people. I'm chairing this group. There are about 40 scientists, and we've started with a research program which we call the AWARE studies, athletes with respiratory infections. And we've just had our first research results out, which we may want to discuss a bit later, but that's made a contribution to understanding how people, and athletes particularly, can get back to sport after they've had COVID safely.
Yeah, I like that you touched on both aspects of that, the prevention, or essentially just assisting in one's less likelihood to severity from a predisposition perspective, but also at the same time focusing on rehabilitation and recovery, because I think both need to be factored in. I think we sometimes find ourselves living in a world where it's all about what do we do once we've experienced the problem, but not about what to do before then. So I really like that aspect of it. Okay, and Prof, maybe if you could please explain to us how SEMLI has contributed towards the process of getting ready the Varsity Cup athletes and other university sports competitions despite the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic.
Again, thanks very much. This is a very pertinent and important question, probably why we're sitting here this afternoon, because I'm sure Mr. Ball will tell us much more about how the Varsity Cup tournament's going to be hosted here. Yeah. But of course, central to SEMLI's involvement is, broadly speaking, the protection of the athletes. And again, it comes down to the prevention part, and then it's a question of monitoring while the athletes are here. We have an electronic system that we've developed. We're still busy developing it, but it'll be ready, that will monitor the status of athletes' health and injuries, including COVID, throughout the tournament. Of course, the provision of the services, medical services, besides the fact that most teams will have some medical support, but to provide that as well. And then we are conducting and we're planning a research project to really see if the ability to hold a tournament such as this in a so-called bubble setting or a geographical setting really does protect the athletes. It's been implemented throughout the world, but it hasn't really been tested, certainly not in South Africa. So we're also conducting a project as part of our service. We'll be monitoring that and see how we can see the impact of holding it in a bubble. Yeah. Maybe provide some guidelines on how to do it better afterwards. Yeah.
So good tracking, good monitoring, and accessibility to professional services combined with the research to know what do we plan for and what do we coordinate for in the future.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, maybe one of the fundamentals of SEMLI's activities is to try and take these three things, teaching, research, and merge them into one. The sweet spot is right in the middle there. And this is a unique opportunity to actually try and do that.
Yeah, and I think that's where you get comprehensive results, but also sustainable results.
And, focus on translational research, which is really getting the results to make an impact immediately.
That sounds great. That sounds great. And moving on to you, Mr. Ball, how has training been adapted to take into account decreased physical contact during this time?
Yeah, so a year ago, like we all know, things changed rapidly. And probably one of the things I'm most proudest about the colleagues within Tuck Sport is the way they've adapted. In the past we spoke about an IQ, then we spoke about an EQ, and now we speak about an AQ, adaptability quotient, and I think that's been the one thing that I've seen across our space is how our head coaches, our coaches, and specifically our athletes, our student athletes and our elite athletes have adapted. So how it's adapted, that started with them going online, for example, having Monday morning Zoom sessions where teams were coming together at their home in their space. It meant us finding ways to get data to them. If you asked me a year ago, would I have to buy someone data to be able to train? I would have laughed at you.
Yeah.
So, you know, it was finding new ways of doing old business.
Yeah.
And so I think we get so caught up in the training complex, in the content around, you know, it's what we do on the field. But training is way more than that. You know, from a psychological perspective, it's the other elements you put in place. So one of the things we've been working on really hard was maintaining the culture in the teams and maintaining the culture within the organization and how, what is the why? Why do we do things the way we do things? So
keeping morale up, essentially.
Exactly. And keep that connectedness, you know, because the challenge that we sit with is we spoke about social distancing, but it's actually physical distancing, but still social connect.
Yeah.
And I think that's been our challenge to do that. Yes, obviously, when we were allowed to get back to formal training, that looked different. There were regulations in place, you know, how many people you can have in a swimming pool, or how many people you can have in a gymnasium, or how many people you can have at a training session, and the screenings and all those sort of elements. If we take it back to a Varsity Cup space, that is looked at, you know, weeks leading up to where there would be no contact training, and systematically bringing in. The coaches have avoided doing too many contact sessions like they may have done in the past, and have now brought it down to more other types of sessions. So there's been a lot of modifications, but the adaptability has been the crucial thing.
Yeah, and I think going in hand with adaptability has also been a lot of resilience building as well. Because, you know, without the access to what one previously had as coping mechanisms, as a live fuel of source, it really also throws into question, how does one cope in that situation? So it's not only adapting to the process of how to maneuver through things, but it's also adapting to how to internally keep myself centered, so that when I get back into the swing of things, I'm still on good footing.
And again, that's not only just for the athletes, it's for the coaches as well. Yeah. It's for the scientists who are integral in those processes, because now they also don't have the physical contact or the close contact they used to have, you know. So the total team was affected. It wasn't just the athlete.
Yeah.
And being able to show resilience in those times, I think has probably been the biggest factor.
Yeah. And how to show cohesiveness when we can't be physically close to one another.
Exactly.
I hear you. Okay, and I think in that regard, when we factor in the COVID-19 picture and we think about how training has been adapted into account to decrease physical contact, what sort of suggestions or recommendations have you had to implement there, and how have you seen that play out?
Yeah, so there's been many things that have happened, but I've also realized over the last 12 months, it's very sport specific. It's very relative to the nature of the program that we're in. It's very relative to the people who lead the program, the head coaches. It's very dependent on the willingness of the group of athletes to respond. But, you know, if you look at it in terms of going one step further and saying, well, what do we do with some of the lessons post-COVID? My question I keep asking is, what is the next COVID? So the research Prof was talking about starts forming a foundation for discussing what is the next thing we need to do. How are we going to adapt? And the one reminder I kept saying to our colleagues within Tuck Sport is, you know, the quote of Churchill that says, never waste a good crisis. There are good things that I believe are coming out of this, and it is different to each organization. In some of our sporting codes, like rugby, for example, it was going back to say, what is our culture? Who are we as a rugby program? And how does that look in 6 months, 2 years, 10 years from now? And what legacy are we leaving behind? So I think those are some of the aspects that we need to say is where are those points we can actually take out? Everybody can take out something positive out of this pandemic, but you choose to take something positive. And I think that's been crucial.
Yeah, and I guess the essence of also what you're saying is there's a lot of variability on the ground as to how it manifests. But with that variability and us finding our feet day by day, that becomes a foundation for how we plan for the future.
Totally. You know, it's a day-to-day thing, because tomorrow we could get a new regulation in place, or it could be changed and it could be relaxed. And the one thing if you ask what we take out of it, we try to go in to a point where when the regulations were put in place for sport to return, we were ready to return. So probably one of the things I'm most proudest about is that the transition from going from an online again into full implementation when we were allowed to within the regulations is exactly what happened.
Yeah.
You know, the next day that the rugby guys could train, they were on the field. The next day the swimmers could dive in, they were diving in.
Yeah.
But we had put systems in place before. So I think it's taught me to say, what are the things we can control at that point in time? Get it ready for when we need it.
That's so useful, because I think you can have COVID-19 as a spanner in the works, but from that moment onwards, planning accordingly from there. And you won't always be spot on, but the best attempt you can make can really go a long way.
100%.
So thank you for that. And I wonder now, how do you foresee these changes being implemented permanently in, the post-pandemic world? What do you foresee there?
So if I take it in a bit of a broader spectrum and not talk only about training and talk about sport as a bigger picture, we need to understand that sport's part of a local, a national, and a global economy. It's not limited to just what we do on this campus. And we need to understand that we've got to take things forward, understanding that things can change constantly. And that's the nature of performance sport. So if I take it again, broader picture, how we train, the amount of contact we do, maybe how many rests or how much rest time we give. Practical example, in swimming, if I take swimming, and I know we're talking a bit more maybe rugby, but in the swimming space, swimmers typically spend 2 weeks out of the pool. Last year, they were spending 100 days out of the pool, in terms of their training. So does that teach us something in the way we do our training, the way we load? Is there some form of science that we can start backing to say, maybe I do need more rest and recovery in this space? The other side is, how do we take sports online? If we look at the business of sport and
digitization,
exactly, and viewership and engagement. So there's a variety of elements that we can take from this.
Yeah. And I guess what you're saying is it's quite a multifaceted approach that we foresee.
100%.
Okay, fantastic. And, thinking about the extra time preparing for Varsity Cup, taking into account that it was not held during the year of 2020, and, given that players actually got extra time to recover and focus on strengthening and conditioning, what do you think has been the impact of that extra time?
Yeah, so I believe in windows of opportunity. And ironically, I think we got a window of opportunity. We had a window of opportunity because university started a month and a half later than normal. We had a window of opportunity to put in potentially a greater off-season preparation, where in the past you may have been at risk of rushing certain parts of your training in your season to build certain elements. Now you were able to hopefully build a greater foundation. And that linked with the fact that we got to acknowledge the last time some of these players played a rugby match was, I think it was the 16th of March 2020. So the physical contact, the impact of the match, the impact of the game is different.
The whole experiential process.
Exactly. And you sit now with new first years that come into a space like this who never got an opportunity to play rugby last year. And that is a risk because they haven't had that physical contact. So, and what type of training had they done? So I really do believe we were given a window of opportunity. It was a window for all the universities to use. Whether we used it or not was our fault, in my opinion. And hopefully we've put the athletes in a better position physically to handle the demands long term.
Yeah. So again, what's happening right now, but also thinking about the future, essentially. Okay. Prof, we haven't forgotten about you. How can the results and the studies that, apply to the broader sport and varsity sports space, how can these results and studies essentially guide us?
So that's the process of research. And I spoke a little bit about translational research. So let me give you 2 examples of things that will apply immediately to Varsity Cup. One of our students, who's a master's student in physiotherapy, has just completed a master's degree last year studying the Varsity Cup, or the rugby teams and the injury rates, and showed that the injury rate's actually quite high. So one of the things we could translate those results to, introducing injury prevention programs, but more importantly, we also want to study what happens with the Varsity Cup injuries in this particular tournament. And we're working with the University of Stellenbosch as well on this project. And one of the things that we are a little bit concerned about, and we worked with Mr. Ball on that, is to make sure that we have injury prevention programs in place, because more matches will be played in a much shorter time period than usual. So recovery time is affected. So that's one example. The other example, perhaps on the COVID side, is that our research, which was published 2 days ago in one of the prestigious sports medicine journals in the world, showed that we can now have some idea as if an athlete has had COVID, who's more likely to take a longer time to get back to sport based on a clustering of symptoms. And these results will help us to guide athletes who've had COVID, and there are, of course, athletes who've had COVID, to get them back to training and recovery and full performance later on. Just 2 examples of how perhaps research does assist in the planning of something like this tournament.
So I guess an investigation into higher intensity, shortened recovery time due to just a change in the whole pace of things, as well as letting the research inform you on how can you identify specific individuals and tailor approaches to optimize their performance.
Yeah, I think the second part of your question is a very, very pertinent one. That's personalized. We speak about personalized medicine, but what you're talking about is personalized sports medicine, which is 100% right.
Yeah.
And we may discuss some aspects around technology and how that helps us in a moment. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. And I think that's essentially where I want to take the conversation. Thinking about how has technology been implemented to help the training and recovery of athletes during the pandemic. We talked about digitization quite a bit, and I just wanted to hear that, implementing technology, what sort of benefit are we seeing there, and how can it be used in this setting?
So the answer to that is a key aspect of current and future work in most fields, but obviously also in sport and sports medicine field. Just to give you an example, we've embraced that right from the outset as one of the key aspects of SEMLI's research, using, in this case, let me just call it wearable technology. I mean, you have a watch and I have a watch, but that's one thing. But using wearable devices and various software platforms to be able to track and monitor and test. You mentioned those words earlier, a group of athletes. So we actually implemented that for a number of years already in all the TUX sports athletes, or TUX the varsity sports athletes. And so we have an online monitoring system that we've used to gather information and also to track athletes' performance, illness, injury risk, etc., the things I've spoken about earlier. And the same technology will also be implemented at the Varsity Cup. We are writing the programs and we're doing that as we speak. There are people working on it.
Yeah.
So technology is a key, I think, not only for this, but for future work in this field.
Yeah. So innovative solutions to contemporary issues, essentially.
Absolutely, and information, but information. But it's not only gathering information, but interpreting and making information work is the key.
Fantastic. Thank you for that.
If I maybe just can add, I think one of our challenges always in sports and sports science is the risk of paralysis by analysis. Because there can be so much information.
Yeah.
And I think part of our discussions over a number of years is how do we do some of the basics really well? So if we are going to use a form of technology or implement it, let's get that really well. Let's use it, even if it's the only one thing we do.
Yeah.
Instead of trying to do a whole bunch of things and get a whole bunch of nothing out of it.
Yeah. So essentially quality over quantity in that regard.
Exactly.
And making sure that translates into results.
Exactly.
Okay. Fantastic. Thank you for that. And I guess a question to you, Mr. Ball. A large part of sport has been about the spectators. And I'm wondering, how does it affect the players' motivation and drive to play in empty stadiums? I can imagine that has a massive psychological impact.
So I think the reality is the player, athletes want to compete. Training is one of the things they do. They don't always enjoy it, but they want to compete. So I think what we're finding and what I believe is that they are so desperate to compete now that the spectator element won't be as big a factor.
Okay.
My bigger concern, though, is for the spectator themselves, because they've been deprived of live sport and the social construct of what we are as a country, as people, is often associated with us gathering together and watching sport live in some shape or form.
Yeah.
So I think from an athlete perspective, yes, obviously a full stadium with 10,000 people getting excited when you score tries is definitely what we all want. But I think they are going to be so hungry to actually be on the pitch again, wearing their jerseys for their university, that it will outdo the fact of the spectators not being there. But I am worried about the spectator almost more, because he or she has not had that opportunity now in a year, and they're not going to get it in the foreseeable couple of months. And that for me is a bigger issue, because that again talks to the social impact and the value of sport in society, rather than just for the sportsman or woman.
That's such an interesting take on it, because I think I completely agree with you that spectatorship of sports has been such a cohesive element, especially in the South African context. So that's a very interesting thing to think about. Thank you for that insight. Prof, with the new opportunities for sport and sports science, what has actually arisen from the pandemic? What new opportunities are we seeing in that regard?
Yeah, thanks very much for that question. It's a really good one. Probably one that one can ponder on a lot. But let me give you a perspective on this. I've devoted my career to sports science and sports medicine. And when I look back over the years, there has been a growth in interest of the scientific aspect of sport over time, and also the medical aspect of how important it is to look after player health over time. But probably not, embraced by everyone, by all coaches and athletes. They haven't always perhaps appreciated that. But what the pandemic has done is actually focused the whole world onto a medical problem. And so the whole world's focused on a medical problem. The whole sports world is also focused on a medical problem. And so the opportunities that have arisen for people like myself, maybe, but younger sports scientists and sports physicians and so on, is that this medical problem actually needs a solution. And so people have spent an enormous amount of time and have achieved an enormous amount in the last 12 months to try and understand the answers to this medical problem that sport and sports medicine, but obviously globally we're facing. And I think that we will only really appreciate the advancements in sports medicine, sports science, and medical science in general in years to come, when we look back at what an exponential and almost even superseding the waves, the exponentiality of it, of information that has been gathered by scientists and medical practitioners during this time. And the same applies to sport and sports medicine. So there's an enormous amount of information that has been gathered.
Fantastic.
That's been, I think, the main opportunity in this.
I think, and also a specialized honing into things a bit more clearly that will yield results in the future. Thank you for that. And Mr. Ball, what the major changes brought in by the pandemic and the effect that it has had on sport, how has it affected women's sport? And I think, we can end off on this question, but I think it's a particularly important question.
Sure. Yeah, so I think things like pandemics have a unique ability to put a spotlight where you have weaknesses in systems. And what you see in some sporting codes, it has not affected the women's sports space. So practically, for example, Netball South Africa last year were able to successfully host a Telkom National League in Bloemfontein. It showcased phenomenal netball talent, and they were able to still elevate women's sport. On the other end of the scale, there's some sporting codes have still prioritized the male sporting events. They have finished leagues, they have started new leagues, but have yet to resume the women's side of the leagues. And that's disappointing, because that says to me that, one, is your resources being spent in places that should be spent? Are we having the right conversations in those federations? And what are the reasons that they are not having their women's sports side to it taking place? Which means that the conversation needs to change in that federation. So I think it's very different to the sporting codes. In some sporting codes, there is equal opportunity. If I take swimming, for example, you have someone like Tatiana who's broken the SA Africa record a few times since the pandemic has been on, and she was able to race. But in other sporting codes, for example, in women's football, they're only now starting to commence the league again. And that for me is disappointing. So I do think, pandemics put spotlights on, like I said, and what we should all be doing, whether I'm in positions of so-called authority or power in federations, be looking where the spotlight is shining and asking uncomfortable questions about how we do business.
Yeah. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic has really given a reflective platform for many of us. I think we're thinking about things far more in depth now than ever before.
Exactly.
Before ending off for today, we have quite an audience tuning in, and I would like to take a few questions from the audience. And starting off with the first question that we have coming through, it's, one of the typical complications is post-COVID fatigue. Any insight on how to deal with this in athletes? And I open that question to either of you.
Well, or maybe I can give it a bash. I mean, that's an interesting question, because the research that we've just published showed that the symptom of excessive fatigue is the single most important predictor of how long it'll take an athlete to recover and get back to sport. So the first observation is that that's a real thing, post-COVID fatigue or excessive fatigue as part of the presentation of COVID in certain individuals. How to deal with this in athletes? I mean, that could be a long answer or a short answer. The short answer is we need to find out first what is the cause of the fatigue. So in other words, we need to make sure that there's not an underlying, more serious complication from COVID. And COVID is a respiratory illness primarily, but it's been shown to affect many organs, including the heart. So our approach to that would be make sure that, that we cover and we make sure that there's not any underlying other organ involvement, particularly the heart. And then the early data show that if you get back to training, but in a very progressive and very scientific and medical ways, in other words, you do it progressively and slowly, that would probably be the most beneficial. Because post-viral fatigue is not uncommon, and so this would be a very similar approach to that. So maybe that's the shortest answer.
Yeah, and I guess sorry, before going into that, but I guess a big thing that you're touching on then is monitoring the distinction between typical presentations and atypical presentations and what sequelae are there, and then addressing it in, again, a tailored approach to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we spoke about that, the personalized or individualized approach, not sort of one size fits all.
Indeed.
Yeah, so I think linked with that is the one thing I've also realized is that every person has responded differently to the pandemic. And how they have responded from a physical perspective to maybe being COVID positive is vastly different amongst many people. And we're seeing that. And those responses thereafter, and when they can return, and that talks to that individual perspective of how do we handle it. Yeah. We forget that this is a pandemic, which is a virus that cannot be seen. Yeah. But we also can't see what's happening to the athletes inside. Yeah. And I think with the work that SEMLI and them have been doing with this whole research and that's allowing us as administrators, as sports people, to be able to get a better snapshot of what do we do with the person post-positive test. And that has given me peace of mind that I'm able to refer someone, and I know there's going to be a comprehensive analysis, whether it be respiratory, cardiovascularly, physically, to be able to make the right decisions. Yeah. And I know that the coaches have appreciated that, because there's also caution. Yeah. People have lost loved ones in this process, and you don't know what those complications could have been. Yeah.
So informed decision-making based on comprehensive assessment.
100%.
Thank you for that. I think we have time for another question. Are South African and UP athletes prepared physically and mentally for the Olympic Games? And again, to either of you.
Yeah, maybe I can just say, I think you used the word resilience earlier. And if there's one thing that I've realized about as South African is we're generally quite a resilient nation. And I think we had a personal advantage in many ways. The reason I say that is if you go to some of what is seen as the first world sporting nations, they often throw everything at their athletes in terms of support. And those athletes are exposed to major competitions often, all the time, and that's what they're used to. In the South African context, we don't always have the same resources. We don't always have the same opportunity to travel to as many of these competitions.
Yeah.
We don't always have all the same types of support structures in place. But yet we find ways of being resilient to use what we've got and to be stronger. The interesting thing is I actually said to a national coach a couple of months ago, I actually think we're in a better position in that specific sporting code than some of the best nations with probably 100 times the budget, because they can't understand why their world is not totally upside down. Ours, we're always adapting. So I'm preferring to take a more positive approach to this thinking.
Yeah.
And that I actually do think we can be okay if we've done the work.
Yeah.
You know, I can't expect now to do the work. And knowing our UP athletes, they've been doing the work.
Yeah.
So I'm positive.
Preparation is key.
Exactly.
And having those pillars and that foundation just helps so much with digging into that resilience when required.
100%.
Thank you. I think we've had quite a number of questions come through, and I wish we had more time. I think it's a very interesting topic that we're discussing, quite comprehensive in its nature. But unfortunately, we have run out of time. And I would just like to thank you, Prof. Schwalnus and Mr. Ball, for sharing your knowledge with us.
Thank you.
Specifically pertaining to the preparation of the Varsity Cup and other athletes during a pandemic, and how SEMLI has contributed towards this future of sport as well as sports science. Thank you to the Faculty of Health Sciences at the University of Pretoria for affording us this platform to empower each other with factual information, especially at a time where accurate factual information is so important in society at the moment. I would ask kindly follow us and subscribe to all of our social media platforms such as Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, LinkedIn, to stay up to date with the research findings as well as interesting development in the fields of health science as well as sport and sports science. Please stay safe and remember that your health is in your hands. Thank you.
At the University of Pretoria's Faculty of Health Sciences, we believe in unearthing potential. We believe in our students' potential to make a positive impact in society and to produce research that shifts boundaries. In order to help students reach their full potential, the Faculty of Health Sciences has established the Life Changers Fund. Partner with us to help our life changers reach their full potential by contributing to the Student Solidarity Fund. Your contribution will help support students who are in need to pay for accommodation, tuition, food, and procure PPE. Join us and help support our students to reach their full potential. Through any contribution, you can be a life changer too. Developing life changers together.